While we're happy to host people's data sets, and we don't go out seeking data sets to put in there, because that's not what we do with our time. We've got research and other stuff to be doing. Anyway, so this is a nice segue actually into what I'm going to talk about, which is Sean Roberts' master's thesis on looking at disclosure risk in data repositories, because I was intrigued, as you'll see from my setup through in the next few slides, at the extent to which people are putting things in data repositories because they're being asked to, and actually there's high disclosure risk. So if anyone chose to, they could identify people in those data sets. So my background to this is to some extent a bit of a personal story as to how I became interested in disclosure risk. Stats officers like Stats New Zealand, ABS, ONS, but possibly limited to stats officers, although I'm intrigued that there was a big discussion of disclosure risk at the ISS meeting, take disclosure risk seriously. And by disclosure risk I mean the risk of identifying a unit in a data file. So Stats New Zealand microdata, which we do a lot of work with, and you'll hear a bit about that this afternoon. They've got the 5 safes framework, so they don't give you the microdata, they keep hold of the microdata and they vet you, safe people, to make sure you're the right sort of person to be doing these analyses, and they put you in a room to analyse the data. So that's the safe settings, that's a data lab, one of which we've got. You have to be a certified people to go in there. They make sure the project's a public good research project. They strip identifiers off and do other things, like for instance in the IDI, except for certain medical projects that really need it, you don't get day of birth information, you only get month and year of birth. Because with day of birth it's far more identifiable, as I will come up to shortly. And when you release stuff, you release it in such a way that you can't identify a person. So you can't release a cell size less than 6. Any other cell has to be random rounded to a number divisible by 3. So stats officers have been taken, and this isn't unique to Stats New Zealand. Other stats officers do, if not the same thing, then certainly similar things to this. And I was aware of this, but I had a problem several years ago where for that modelling the early life course model I mentioned in the intro before, which is a simulation model of children developing through life, what I wanted to do was get a base file for that. And I wanted a base file that was representative of the New Zealand population. I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll get a base file that looks like births or 0-year-olds technically in the 2006 census. So 2006 is the starting point and you simulate from there. But of course, Stats New Zealand wouldn't just give me those data because they're data on real people. And I wanted this microsimulation model to be used by all sorts of people. So we've now got the microsimulation model. It's available for anyone to use, including people in government, and they can just go to URL and use it. And to have that, you'll need to have data in there that isn't identifiable. So Stats New Zealand, I thought, well, what if I take, and that's what the microsimulation model looks like if you go there, if I take the 2006 data and modify it in some such way that you can never identify an individual but still looks like the same patterns of the population that you would see there. And I had to convince Stats New Zealand at the time that you couldn't identify a real person in there. And I did that, and they allowed me to release what looked like a real data file but was actually a synthetic data file, if that makes sense. So these are all the steps that you have to go through. Okay, so just a bit of terminology here. By identity disclosure, I mean it's identifying you in the data file. In and of itself, I don't think that's a bad thing to say that I'm in a particular data file, but I think it is bad conditionally because it may allow attribute disclosure. That is finding out things about you in the data file that wouldn't otherwise be known. There's this distinction that tends to be made that I don't think is that useful actually, between sensitive data or sensitive variables and non-sensitive variables. And I think it's not all that useful because for different people, different variables are sensitive. So the way I think, identity disclosure is bad because it may allow attribute disclosure, and disclosing attributes may be bad. And you don't want to do that, regardless of any judgments on whether you think it's sensitive or not. And this is a lot easy, or very easy, if you've got direct identifiers in there. So if you've got a data set that's got names, addresses, and phone numbers, etc., you can identify who those people are without much effort at all because it's written down there. And this is the sort of thing you see hitting the headlines where someone dropped a file in Wellington somewhere and it's ACC cases of all the injuries that people have had, and it's got names and addresses, and it's a big embarrassment for ACC, that sort of thing. But even without direct identifiers, this doesn't tend to hit the headlines, which is one of the issues. I think people don't realise this. You can still identify people with quasi-identifiers, things that don't directly identify people, but when you know them and you combine them in certain ways, you can identify a person. So things like date of birth, for instance. I think I do get onto this in the next slide, so maybe I won't foreshadow that. But if you've got date of birth, gender, location, in New Zealand certainly, you can probably identify a person. And there's various other things that once you cross-tabulate them, you can identify a person. Or if you bring in some extra information from outside. Point is, anonymous does not mean non-identifiable. Just because you've anonymized the data set and stripped off all the direct identifiers doesn't mean that you cannot identify people in that data set if you are of a mind to. Re-identification is often possible either with some extra information or if you stratify down. And it's one of the reasons Stats New Zealand doesn't, A, you sign something saying you're not going to try and re-identify people, and B, even if you tried, you can't release that information because, as I said, you can't release a cell size less than 6. Now, this is a real issue in a small place like New Zealand. There are 60 to 70,000 people of the same age in New Zealand. You can see that from the Stats New Zealand's live tables, which means if you divide that down by the 365, there are roughly 100 people who share the same date of birth and are male, and roughly 100 people who share the same date of birth and are female. And there's very, very few people who share the same date of birth and are gender diverse. So, if you know the date of birth and you know gender, you wouldn't have to stratify by much more, region perhaps, to produce an N equals 1 or close to. At that point, you've identified an individual. Failure to recognise this can lead to disaster. So, this is my if I had a longer talk, I'd go through several examples of this, but this is my favourite one. And it's an old one. More than 20 years ago, the Massachusetts Group Insurance Commission released anonymised health data on state employees, basically to enable research to improve healthcare. So this is a noble aim. They want to open up for researchers to use these data so they can look at what particular treatments are having good effects, sort of early instantiation of big data, if you like. And the Massachusetts governor at the time assured the public that privacy was protected because they removed their direct identifiers. Latanya Sweeney, who was a computer science PhD student at the time at MIT, thought this isn't the case. She knows because of what she was doing in computer science. She accessed the health data. She went and bought the electoral roll for $20 for Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where the governor lived. And that included, which is more than you get in the New Zealand electoral roll actually, name, address, zip code, birth date, and sex of every voter in that particular city. There were 6 in Cambridge who shared the governor's birth date. Only 3 were men, and only 1 lived in a zip code. So by doing that, by paying $20 with released data that the Massachusetts Group Insurance Commission had released, she was able to identify the governor. And what she did is she identified all his health records and she sent them to him and said, you've made a big mistake here. You've released information that people can be used for identification. So this is a bad thing. Which got me thinking, researchers are being asked to deposit data files in publicly available repositories, the likes of which Martin has just talked about, for good reasons, for reanalysis by other researchers in the interest of open science. And, these things work. So there's evidence that by putting things out into the open, you yourself actually get more citations than you otherwise would have got, which is what this study showed. And journals are asking researchers to do this. So this is just something I took from Wiley, a publisher who published lots of journals. And there's this principle called FAIR, that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And they say when data is fair, should be when data are fair. When data is fair, the process becomes more efficient as you can access and analyse each other's findings and reuse it to inform new findings. And they came up with this table here for what their different journals' policies are. So we've got one that sort of encourages data sharing but doesn't go any further. One that expects data sharing, and then you've at least got to make a data availability statement. And there's various journals that do that. One that mandates data sharing, you have to do it. One that both mandates data sharing and they have a look at your data. And I was slightly encouraged by, they've got a list of things, ways you can do these data availability statements. And there's one here that says data available on a request due to privacy ethical restrictions. The data that support the findings of the study are available on request from the corresponding author. The data are not publicly available due to privacy or ethical restrictions. So at least they were thinking about this. It might be an issue. And as well as journals, funders are starting to consider whether data archiving is made a requirement if you get funding from a funding agency. I'm interested to talk to Francine later about what the Royal Society's view is on this. Anyway, HRC, many years ago, 2011, they signed a joint statement by funders of health research that they would share research data for improving public health. And they said at the time, over the next few months, the HRC will be working to establish a data sharing policy for the health research we fund. And further down, it says, we're working through a number of issues, including, but not limited to, the nature of informed consent for future unspecified use of data, how to protect an individual's privacy, and who pays for data curation. All the sorts of issues you should be caring about. Curiously enough, they still do not have that policy, to the best of my knowledge. So they said they were coming up with one in 2011, but didn't actually come up with one. And again, I don't know what the Royal Society is doing, and I don't know what others do, but I'm interested in this side of things. The Medical Research Council, on the other hand, say they expect valuable data arising from MRC-funded research to be made available to the scientific community with as few restrictions as possible so as to maximise the value of the data for research. Such data must be shared in a timely and responsible manner. It doesn't go on to explain what they mean by responsible, whether they mean, you need to have good metadata in terms of responsible, in terms of making it useful, or responsible in terms of making sure it can't be hacked. Anyway, so this got us to the point of thinking, well, let's actually have a look at this. To answer two research questions. So by doing the right thing, are researchers inadvertently risking identity and attribute disclosure for those on whom data have been collected? So what I got Sean Roberts, master's student, to do was to investigate the disclosure risk of data sets in publicly available data archives. Do some data sets in there have high disclosure risk? And the second question, is enough being done to ensure researchers do the right thing safely? Do data archives have policies on disclosure risk, and do they highlight the risk of disclosure to researchers? That's what we wanted to look at. What we need to do for that is identify the data archives to investigate, identify disclosure risk methods which will allow us to assess whether something has a high or low disclosure risk, calculate them, and then have a look through the websites of these data archives to investigate the policies regarding disclosure risk. Okay, so what we wanted to do is identify repositories that were open access, that contain microdata as opposed to tabular data, so they've actually got data on an individual, whether or not individual can be identified, and cover a broad range of research disciplines. We didn't want to necessarily make this specific to the social sciences. And long story short, many were ruled out that weren't general discipline, but we came across Dataverse, which seems to be where, as Martin pointed out, where the field is heading. So we found 32 repositories, so not the 43 that Martin came across, and chose to look at the three largest English language repositories, the Harvard Dataverse, the Scholars Portal Dataverse, which is a Canadian one. Harvard Dataverse, as we'll see shortly, is the biggest one. And the UNC, that's University of North Carolina Dataverse, which tends to curate data from UNC and other surrounding universities in North Carolina, like Duke, for instance. And added to that, we decided to look at ADA as well, because we were considering, and still are considering, putting our data in there. We've agreed to, actually. Okay, so these are the number of data collections that are in the data sets, and I'll explain what that means shortly. So you can see that it was really, if you look at Harvard there was a big dump of data sets put in 2015 as they were getting underway, and then fewer since. 2018 is lower because it was only partway through the year that we did this table. But we decided to focus on 1 year of downloads, 2017, the most recently completed year that had occurred at the time that Sean was doing his thesis. And what we wanted to do is sample up to 25 data collections. So data collection is Could be one data set or could be several data sets, but it's all sort of tagged with the same name, if that makes sense. But we wanted to go down to the data set level. The 25 data collections tagged as replication, that it means it's actually linked to a paper. So that was a proxy for us for, well, has a journal asked for this data set to be put there? But anyway, we know that this data set is attached to this particular paper over there, and 25 of the remaining data collections. Whilst only including data about humans, where they've got metadata sufficient to calculate disclosure risk, the data are publicly available. You may have to go through a step of filling out a form, but if there was a form that wasn't specific to the data archive, but you have to go to the researcher themselves, we decided we weren't going to look at those because we really wanted to focus on the ones that were easy to get. And we excluded ones that turned out not to be microdata. So these are the numbers of data sets we got in the end, and that was actually a census of that whole year for ADA, Scholars Portal, and UNC. Harvard, we stopped when we got to 25, basically, 25 data collections. And that's the number of data sets that we could get. So 27 ADA, 107 Harvard, 17 Scholars Portal, and 47 UNC. And we needed to come up with disclosure risk methods. Ideally, what we wanted is methods that could give you an overall level of disclosure risk for a file and also look at it from a record level. So are individual records within a data set have high disclosure risk? And also we needed to rely on methods where you've got information just from the file itself and very little else. So if there were methods that required information, lots of information from elsewhere, we ruled them out. The two we settled on was something called the data intrusion simulation, because it seemed to us to be the most intuitive and implementable in terms of the information that you needed. Basically, it calculates a file-wide probability that unique matches on a set of quasi-identifiers, so the age sets, that sort of thing, are correct matches. And for that, all you need is the number of sample uniques or pairs on those quasi-identifiers and the sampling fraction that that particular data set was of whatever the population was. So not much extra information is needed. Having said that, there was often a little bit of effort needed to work out what the population was, to work out what the sampling fraction was. In terms of record level, we came across a method called special uniques detection algorithm, which scores each record based on the number and size of unique patterns. So in a data set, I may be identifiable on 7 characteristics, the 7 that I go looking for, but I might also be identifiable on a subset of 5 of those and a different subset of 6 of those, etc., etc. That's the unique patterns. One of the issues with that is it allows you to compare within a file, but doesn't allow you to compare across files. You can calibrate it to the one at the top, the data intrusion simulation method, to get a record level degree of disclosure risk that's comparable then across different data sets. And what you need there is just the file itself and the estimate from above. Okay, now I'm running out of time, so I'll run through this quite quickly. Assess uniqueness on the following quasi-identifiers where we could get them. Age or date of birth was there, gender, ethnicity, race, whatever was there, or sometimes country of birth, employment status, education, marital status, region. Sometimes you'll know all those things about people, sometimes you won't, but when other people have done this type of research, they've used more things than that. And what we did as well is we ignored missings there. So if gender was missing, it doesn't become a category. So a particular cell we look for a unique for wouldn't be, I know that they're 47 and have missing gender. We ruled those cases out because really that person isn't identifiable like that. Okay, and these are the results. So what I've got there, and I hope you can read this from afar, is this is the file level. And what we've done is grouped disclosure risk into very low, up to 0.01, low 0.01 to 0.05, medium 0.05 to 0.1, high 0.1 to 0.5, and very high, greater than 0.5. What you see here is the Australian Data Archive has a bit of a mix. a range across the different levels of disclosure. Some are very high in high disclosure, but many are lower than that. Everywhere else, there's a predominance of very, very low disclosure risk, which is an occasional blip here or there. Except these three here for the non-replication data sets from Harvard that were very high. And just looking at those two, the ADA and the Harvard non-replication, you can see the three data sets there that were, or the data sets that are very high disclosure risk. This here, everyone in there has very high disclosure. This one here, everyone in there has very high disclosure. And this one here, most people are high or very high. And there's three in Harvard there that have very high disclosure risk. Mostly fine, but there's an occasional data set that has very high disclosure risk. So as I said, most files had very low disclosure risk. There were 6, however, with very high disclosure risk. 3 ADA Dataverse files, and the reason they have high disclosure risk is they contained one variable that was very granular, postcode. So, because you've got postcode there and a few other bits and pieces, it means you've actually got quite a lot of sample. It's quite easy to get a sample unique. In fact, everyone in there was a sample unique or close to. The Harvard Dataverse ones, this is where we cheated. We didn't actually calculate the disclosure risk because we found 3 files that had names and mobile phone numbers. So we just said, you're very high disclosure risk for everyone in there without going through and doing the calculation. It should work out that way anyway, the way the system works. Now, one thing to say here, ADA, I think, of all the dataverses, of the 4 dataverses that we looked at, have the strongest restrictions around whether you can access data or not. So it's by application. You have to state your purpose, and they assess on a case-to-case basis whether or not to release the data to you. So ADA were made aware that we're assessing disclosure risk, and researchers responsible for data agreed to release on the files on that basis. That we were doing this just to identify disclosure risk. Now, I need to talk to Sean about this, but we're going to tell both dataverses that, hey, you've got some data, we'll tell them what the data sets are. These dataverses have these data sets that have high disclosure file risk. Just a little comment here, if anything, our estimates were underestimates. We had to estimate sampling fractions, which wasn't always easy, and if we couldn't work out what the population was, we defaulted to, well, let's look at the adult population in that particular country. To the extent that that was an overestimate, then our sampling fractions are also overestimates, and our disclosure risk estimates will be underestimated. Don't think it has much of an impact though, because if you think back to the graphs I showed you a couple of slides ago, most files had either extremely low or extremely high disclosure risk. So even if we got the sampling fraction wrong and the disclosure risk wrong, it wouldn't be wrong by very much and wouldn't shift it up along that graph very much. In terms of policies, ADA allows datasets with high disclosure risk but have protections around release, as I've just mentioned before. Application forms for most datasets and terms and conditions expressly forbid re-identification. The other 3 pretty much have the standard data-first conditions about exclusion of identifying information. They basically tell researchers, you shouldn't really put stuff in here with identifying information, but clearly that's not very well monitored. They allow you to put stuff in there and don't actually check it. There are no clauses on re-identification risk. Guidelines for use indicate that users shouldn't attempt to re-identify things, but there's no real way for checking that or stopping people doing it. Okay, so just to finish up here, data sets with high disclosure risk can be found in data archives. It's not a lot of data sets, but even finding 1, in our case 6, I think is concerning. The high disclosure is mostly caused by the inclusion of highly granular variables, postcode, or in the case of the Harvard Dataverse one, where they actually had names and mobile numbers. My view certainly is that they should be removed. I mean, most of these aren't really needed for research. They're just in there because they were in there historically. Or, at the very least, if some sort of location variable is needed, then you bring it up to a size that means that you don't have high disclosure risk. And I think more should be done by data archives, journals and funders to educate researchers about disclosure risk rather than just telling them, you should do this. And I think it's always possible to keep data high quality while protecting the disclosure risk of information. So here you've got the original data. You don't have to reduce it to no data or useless data to go below the high disclosure risk mark. you can release data by saying aggregating up postcodes and still have the data of good use to a lot of people. So thanks, I know I've gone over time, but maybe a couple of questions, and if I have to cut the discussion short, then we can have a discussion over lunchtime. So thank you. Hey.
Hi. So a question about the data that you found that has very high disclosure. So just to be clear, you're saying that you feel that that data has abrogated the Dataverse guidelines and should be removed.
The Harvard one certainly did.
Yep.
They don't say something specifically around high disclosure risk. They're saying identifying information.
Okay, so my question is, do the Dataverses have data breach guidelines? So where there has been a breach, do they have guidelines to say this is what you do now?
Relying on the information of my student here, to the best of my knowledge, no. There's just kind of all care, no responsibility here. You say you won't do it. There's no penalties as far as I'm aware for doing it.
Yeah.
There was a similar question I was asked yesterday, actually talking about the Dataverse stuff. Was do they have any information on their privacy and data restriction systems? Are they hackable? Have there been any external things coming in and just getting access to data that they shouldn't be getting access to? It was a question again that I was like, I don't actually know. The idea of this data archive where we are trying to work out who's using your data, you'd think they'd want to know.
Hey.
Just wondering if you have a view on the disclosure risk of the IDI.
Well, again, going back to the original slide, Stats New Zealand have the 5 safes protocol. So they don't, unlike these, you can't go somewhere and download the data and try and hack it. You are accessing it in control conditions for reasons that they have approved, and you sign something that says, at least, you will not try and identify people. In my view, disclosure risk isn't the biggest issue with the IDI, it's public confidence in the fact that there is something that does link all people together. If you went in and tried to, I'm sure you could try and disclose people, because there's little you could do with the information given the other restrictions that Stats New Zealand have. And, as an aside, you can get health data of probably greater disclosure risk than IDI data just sent to you for analysis by Ministry of Health, because it will have date of birth there, which the IDI typically won't have. As I mentioned before, stratify that by a couple of things, you're down to an individual.